Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was at the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. All right. St. Paul, in his letter to the Roman Christians, and in letters to Christians in other cities, is making a radical and revolutionary claim, which once again is going to bring about a wholesale transformation in the history and foundations of Western law. So it's not an understatement to say that Hammurabi is a big deal. This idea of codifying the law is a huge deal, which has had lasting and enduring and significant implications for law in the American tradition and throughout the West. It's not an understatement to say that Aristotle is a big deal. This idea that we can reason about legal justice and draw inferences from the way that humans act for the good. That Moses is a big deal. This is another big deal. This is another big, huge watershed, which is going to quite dramatically transform the landscape of Western jurisprudence in ways that we'll continue to see throughout the semester, you'll continue to see throughout your law school education, and you'll continue to encounter on occasion in your legal careers. Paul's radical revolutionary claim is this, that all three of the traditions we've examined so far, the tradition of sovereign rule, the tradition of divine command, and the tradition of law as reason, all three of them converge and find their fulfillment in one person called Jesus of Nazareth. So the idea expressed in these scriptures is that Jesus is king. In fact, the claim is made of him that he is king above all other kings, even above Creon and Hammurabi, has the ultimate right to be obeyed. And the claim is also made that he brings the greatest and best of the laws of God himself, which simultaneously fulfill and supplant the laws of Moses, directing us toward life and to flourishing, to what is good. And that he is the master, the one whom Socrates sought in his dialogue with Crito when trying to determine, what shall I do? His law is described as the law of love, whatever that means. I'll unpack it a little bit today. And is summarized in what are called, in the tradition, the two great commandments that are supposed to be the fulfillment and summation of all the laws that came before, all the laws we've studied so far, and render obsolete and superfluous all the laws we're going to study going forward. The first is to love God with all one's heart, mind, and strength, and the second is to love one's neighbor as oneself. And the claim made here is that this law perfects the sources of law that we've already examined. In the Christian account, the reason to obey God's commands is that God created you, then redeemed you after you rebelled against him, and knows and wants what is good for you. The reason to obey human rulers, St. Paul goes on to say, is that God put them over you for your good. Strong medicine, yeah? Which is going to create some tensions, which we'll be unpacking for the next two classes. The reason to obey the law of reason, then, is that reason is a gift from God. And this is where the tension is going to come from. Because as intimated in the gospel reading for today, and as brought fully into focus next class, when we encounter Martin Luther King Jr., sometimes the law of the human sovereign and the law of reason conflict with each other. But we'll bracket that for now and set it aside. Let's focus on the predicate first. This idea that the law of love, whatever that means, is the fulfillment of all the law. It's all predicated on this idea that the guy who articulates the law of love is who he says he is. And the evidence for that claim, Paul says, is found throughout the scriptures and throughout all creation. You see references to it in the short excerpt from the Gospel of Mark that you read for today. So here's a subtle way that this shows up in Mark chapter 12. Look at Jesus' methodology. He speaks in parables, stories, which is reminiscent of what tradition of thinking about law that we encountered so far this semester? Who gave us stories about the law? Socrates. Sophocles is a great ancient tradition of storytelling about questions of law and justice, isn't there? Jesus continues in that tradition. So like Sophocles, he's going to tell us stories about law and justice. Like Socrates and Aristotle, he's going to ask questions. He's going to teach propositionally, both directive and rhetorical. As when he asks, how can the scribes say that the Christ is the son of David? It's a Socratic question. He's already got in his mind what he believes to be the right answer to that question. He's trying to see if the people whom he's interrogating, smart and well-educated lawyers, have an answer to that question. And then finally, he issues commands with the authority of a ruler, such as render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. So we see each of these three traditions illustrated in Jesus' methodology. He's drawing on the tradition of storytelling, the tradition of reasoning Socratically, and the tradition of command and rule. Now, whatever we think of this claim, we should note three things about this Jesus Christ of Nazareth. First, his behavior is totally unlike that of all the people before him who claimed to be king. Not only does he not punish the wicked and assert his right to be obeyed, those of you who know the story know that he goes on to stand trial for a crime he did not commit and is crucified by Roman authorities. He puts himself under the law rather than above it, even while claiming to be the source of it. He, in this way, reverses the perspective of all the ancient rulers, flips the lens upside down. All the ancient rulers, remember, sought to be obeyed. This Jesus of Nazareth guy seeks first to obey. That's odd. Second, his law is totally unlike all the laws that have come before. The Code of Hammurabi, the Lex Talionis, the Ten Commandments, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, all exact a proportionate sanction for a wrong. By contrast, Jesus says, if someone hits you in the face, you're supposed to turn the other cheek so they can hit that one too. Weird. If someone steals from your cloak, you're supposed to give that person your tunic as well. This law of love doesn't look much like law in the ancient sense of lex talionis. It looks more like a prescription for something else. Call it charity. Third, this Jesus of Nazareth is not content with half measures. There is no area of your life which is exempt from the law of love. If you're a really clever lawyer, you can find their interstices between the various provisions of Hammurabi's code and find some parts of your life that are not governed by it. Not so with the law of love. This law of love is not merely an improvement on the ancient codes. He claims that this law of love is the ultimate fulfillment of all other laws and that you're bound to it always and everywhere. And he claimed that the authority for this is that he himself is God. Precisely, he claims to be the Son of God. And elsewhere in the Gospels, he uses the same name for himself that God, the lawgiver, had given for himself when he first introduced himself to Moses, the law receiver. I am, the source of all being, the uncaused cause, the one who was, is, and is to come. Same one who, according to the Hebrew Scriptures, speaks all things into existence, sustains them by his word, and then gives you commands so that you can live well. It's that one. So let's take a look a little bit more closely at Mark 12 and unpack some of this a little bit. Let's hear from, where is Brianna Bennett?
Here.
This is Bennett. What did you notice about the 12th chapter of the Gospel of Mark?
It started with like a parable of the vineyard.
The parable of the vineyard. What is this parable of the vineyard and the tenants? What does it say and what is it about? How do you interpret it?
Well, it started with that there's people renting the vineyard and
Let's pause there for a second. What do you mean by renting it?
like they're living on it but paying the person who owns the land to live there.
They're tenants. What kind of a relationship is the landlord-tenant relationship?
It's not very good.
Well, this one isn't very good. But is the landlord-tenant relationship a natural relationship, like parent and child? Or is it like a friendship? How does the landlord-tenant relationship come into being? How does it come about? What is a tenant? What does it mean?
A tenant is like someone who's renting it, and a lot of times, like nowadays, like you can just look at property or look at a place and like meet the person right there and rent and be a tenant that way. Like,
What does it mean to be a tenant? How would you define a tenant?
someone who's renting something from someone else.
What does that mean to rent something?
To not own it but still live there.
To not own it but still live there. Suppose I went out in the parking lot and took possession of your car. I don't own it. I'm just going to take possession of it. Would you think I have a right to do that?
No, I guess part of the relationship is like entering into a contract.
Some sort of legal authority. We're going to call it not a contract, but a lease. We'll meet leasehold estates next semester in property. But that sounds like it's sort of a legal relationship. It's not a relationship of sheer power, like the relationship that we would have if I just took possession of your car, put a gun to your head and said, give me your car. It's not a relationship it's not a natural biological relationship like I have with my 5 daughters. It's not a sociability relationship like I have with, say, Professor McFarland or with Dean Campbell. A professional relationship. It's a legal relationship. It's a legal status. And what is the legal status of the tenant? You said they don't own the vineyard. Do they have the right to be there?
Yes, that's part of the lease.
Okay, so in a sense, they do own the vineyard, but not in a comprehensive sense. They own the vineyard in the limited sense that they have the right to possess the vineyard. But because they don't own it in the comprehensive sense, they owe some duties to someone else. Who's that?
That would be the owner of the actual vineyard.
The person who created the vineyard, who planted the vines, who built the barns, who built the walls around the vineyard. What's the source of the owner's right to receive rent or fealty from the tenants?
It would be what they agreed on and wrote in the lease.
Okay, well, why did they agree to it? Why would they acknowledge? Why didn't they just move in and just take it? That's what they're trying to do at the end of the story, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just take it. They're asserting, by the end of the story, they no longer acknowledge the original owner's right to the vineyard, do they?
No.
Why do they acknowledge it at the beginning of the story?
I guess because the owner wouldn't let them be there if they didn't start by honoring the lease.
Okay. Why didn't they just punch him in the face and take it? Shoot him dead. Bang, bang. What are they acknowledging at the beginning of the story that they're not acknowledging at the end of the story? But what's the difference in their attitude between the beginning and end of the story?
At the beginning, they had, I would guess they thought they had a moral obligation to adhere to the contract. And by the end of it, they throw it out their morals and just succumb to their greed.
At the beginning of the story, they think they have a moral obligation to obey the law. And by the end of the story, they've decided they don't have a moral obligation to obey the law. And that's ultimately what the story comes to, isn't it? Okay, tell us a little bit more about how the story unfolds. How do they get from the beginning of the story, where they're obeying the law, where they're recognizing the duties they have as tenants to the original owner, to the end of the story where they've tossed all that out the window?
The owner sends several servants to collect like his portion from the vineyard that they owed him for living there and being there, and then they beat up some of them and kill some of them, and the last one he sends is his son, and they end up killing his son.
Now, do we have any idea whom the owner's servants and the son are supposed to represent allegorically? Who do you suppose the original owner is supposed to represent? Probably God. Yeah, that's like your typical Sunday school answer, right? Sounds like a squirrel, but I'll say Jesus. Yeah. Probably God. Yeah. All right. Who then are the first servants?
Prophets.
The prophets. What do they do to the prophets?
Execute.
They beat him up, right? And then finally he sends his son and says, well, don't listen to my son. Who's that supposed to represent?
Jesus.
The guy who's speaking right now. How's that going to work out? He's foretelling his own death, isn't he? Why does Jesus think that people who live on earth would have an obligation of gratitude to God? Did the tenants make the vineyard? On whose right do they stand when they occupy the vineyard? The original owner. Did you make yourself? Did you make earth?
No.
Did you make this law school? No. So the analogy obviously is we, human beings, inhabit good places and institutions and norms that we did not create. And this, the parable is supposed to suggest, implies certain obligations, doesn't it? If we don't fulfill those obligations, are we acting lawfully? No. We're acting contrary to our obligations. Okay? Well, how about this? This seems to suggest that we should obey the law, right? Okay. What if the giver of the law, say Caesar, tells you, I want you to take this spear or this javelin and go out on the street here and slaughter as many children as you can possibly find? That's a law. Do you have an obligation to obey it?
When we get into the next part, it talks about like giving to Caesar what is Caesar and giving to God what is God.
Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. If Caesar demands that you pay taxes, what are you supposed to do, says Jesus? Pay taxes. Does everything belong to Caesar? If Caesar demands your soul, your moral integrity, are you supposed to give him that? Why not? That belongs to God. So far, from the first two stories, a parable and a Socratic dialogue, we've got the basic idea that we owe moral obligations to those who are superior to us to obey their laws. That's from the parable, right? The tenants fail insofar as they fail to pay their duties as tenants, the rent. But it's complicated. We're supposed to pay what we owe to the owner, that to whom the thing belongs. But it's complicated because different things in our possession belong to different owners. The taxes, the money, belongs to Caesar. Your soul doesn't belong to Caesar, it belongs to someone else. So we need to know a little bit more about these obligations. Jesus sums up the two obligations in two commandments. Can you state them for us?
Love the God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself.
Okay, so we have then all of the law, Jesus says, summarized in these two commandments. One of them goes vertically to the source of all that is good. The other goes horizontally to your fellow human beings, which is the source, it's suggested, of your obligation to obey those obligations to other humans. Why does he stop there? Why doesn't he go into the Ten Commandments and the Levitical Code? And why does he think it's enough to know these two commands?
Because they are all encompassing, like the Ten Commandments and everything else.
What do you mean they're all encompassing?
If you can follow this too, then you can hopefully follow this.
If you will always obey those commandments, do you need to worry about the rules? If you're always, say, loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, are you going to violate the prohibition of the commandments against having false idols? Like Ford F-150s or Alabama football. No, you'll enjoy those in moderation, won't you? You won't worship them. If you're always loving your neighbor as yourself, are you going to commit murder? Are you going to defame your neighbor? Commit perjury against you? You're not, are you? So there's a sense in which this law of love sort of renders all the other law obsolete, doesn't it? Which is interesting. And then finally, tell us the difference in your own words between the tenants at the beginning of the chapter and the widow at the end of the chapter. What's the difference in their actions? And what does this difference in their actions show about their different relationship to law?
She gave everything. She had very little, and she gave what she needed to God, because that was what was asked of her.
Did she have an obligation to give everything?
Not necessarily.
She gave out of love or charity. She, in other words, followed the two great commandments. So the difference, we might say, is that the tenants had an obligation to give this much, and instead they gave this much. The widow had an obligation to give this much, and she gave this much. Why? What law was motivating the tenants? They tell us at the end of the parable, don't they, what they're up to. What's their rationalization for killing the son?
They wanted the inheritance.
They think that by killing the son, they're going to promote themselves from the status of tenants to the status of owner. Does the widow have any such ambitions when she drops all of her income in the offering plate?
No.
What is she up to?
She does it of her own free will.
She does it of her own free will. What does that mean? The tenants were acting of their own free will, don't we think? Or do you think the tenants acted, it's like a West Side Story. We're depraved on account of we was deprived, right? Officer Krupski, it's all my fault, right? I'm just a degenerate, yeah, right? Or do we think they had free will? The tenants could have chosen to obey the law. Do we think that or not? They could have chosen. And that actually makes their choice worse, doesn't it? If someone holds a gun to your head and says, pull the trigger, we think that's not as culpable as if you voluntarily pick up the gun without coercion and pull the trigger, right? Free choice is a very terrifying thing, isn't it? It can be used for great evil and great good. Remember, Aristotle said humans aren't better than animals, they're greater than animals. They can be either better or worse. This radical power of free choice. Okay, good. Let's talk for a few minutes about Paul's letter to the Romans. We mentioned a few minutes ago, Paul is now marrying these three traditions we've been examining so far. So Paul, in Romans 1 and 2, is going to make the case that law is reason and revelation, and then in Romans 13 he's going to add, and sovereign rule. So you have reasons to obey the law which are grounded in reason, whether or not you're a Hebrew who was given the Ten Commandments. You know what the law is in at least certain respects. In revelation, especially if you've been given the Holy Scriptures. And in sovereign rule, because the coercive force of the state is there to do you good. Now, Paul opens his letter to the Romans with credentials. And he gives us two resumes. His first is his own credentials. He's an apostle. In the Christian tradition, an apostle is someone with authority. That is, a human being to whom God delegates authority over the church. And the apostolic traditions today, which are carried on by the Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern and Greek Orthodox churches, the Anglican Communion, each are headed by bishops who claim a line of direct succession of authority from one of the original 12 apostles. Paul then turns to the credentials of this Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus is both man and God. That's the claim. In the flesh, he's a descendant of King David, who has David's authority to claim the throne of Israel. In the spirit, he's the Son of God with authority to claim power over all creation, as evidenced by his resurrection from the dead. And then he sounds a theme that has preoccupied the ancient kings throughout our course so far, from Creon to Hammurabi to David. The point of this Jesus of Nazareth's appearance on earth is to bring about righteousness. We've seen that claim before, haven't we? The point of the law of love is to bring about righteousness. But righteousness now comes not from the Levitical code or from any code, but from something called the gospel, this law of love. Paul then moves into an extended discussion about wisdom and folly. So now he's been talking in the Revelation tradition of the Hebrew Scriptures. He's now going to put on a different hat and speak as the Greeks do, about reason and wisdom and folly. Very Aristotelian, with one important difference. Remember, Aristotle thought that the young man who's still enslaved to the passions has not yet attained practical wisdom, and that some people are just incapable of it. So the young man, the vicious man, are more like beasts than men. He's not perfected his human rational nature over time by exercising the virtue of reason and justice. And so Aristotle concluded from this that some people just have a higher nature than others. Some are destined to be slaves, and others are destined to be philosopher kings. And that's just the way it is. Some people possess practical wisdom, some don't. And it's just your lot in life. Paul makes quite a radically different claim. Paul thinks that each of us has the capacity to be more or less fully human. Each of us gets to choose which direction we will go. Any one of us can be more fully human by acting as God designed us to act according to the law of reason, doing what is good, or we can choose to exchange what he calls the image of God. Remember, the image of God in both the Hebrew tradition, see Moses, and the pagan tradition, see Cicero, refers to the capacity to reason and choose. We can exchange that capacity, the image of God, for what he calls the image of animals. We can act more like God, or we can act more like beasts. Paul argues that we all start off with practical wisdom, knowledge of the law, which is written on the heart. And if we follow that practical wisdom, that knowledge of what is right, over time, over time we will come to allow it to govern us. We'll become more virtuous. But he says some people shackle reason and throw it into the corner and submit themselves to their passions. And if you follow that route, Paul says, you'll become more and more enslaved to your passions, and your reason will become weaker and weaker. So by giving into vice, we exchange the image of God within us for the image of beasts and creeping things. The idea here was later developed in the Christian tradition into the idea of what's called the capital vices. The capital vices. Paul is specifically focused here on the capital vice of lust. In the Christian tradition, there are 7 of them. Lust is one of them. 7 capital vices: pride, envy, anger, sloth, avarice, gluttony, and lust. And the idea here is that if you indulge in these vices, you incapacitate your reason, you distort and misdirect your passions, and you lead on to other vices. And Paul talks about how they're all related to each other. You indulge in one of these vices, you end up indulging in all of them. That's the basic idea. And then ultimately you lose your practical wisdom and you become a fool. This is one reason, Paul suggests, why God has authorized governments to exercise authority. And so he says in Romans 13 that God gives government the sword for our good. Because not everybody acts reasonably. So for the sake of conscience, we should obey the law and pay our taxes. In fact, he says we should give everyone their due right away. Owe nothing to anyone, unlike the tenants, who would not pay their obligations. Be like the widow, who freely gave, more than what was required of her. This is what the law of love requires, says Paul. It requires an eager willingness to give everybody his due at all times. And that willingness to do good is threatened by malice and other vicious actions, which entail a willingness to do evil. Okay, very briefly, in half an hour, that's the Christian tradition of law. That's all we have time for in this course, because we have a lot of other ground to cover this semester. But with that as background, I want to take a look at the 2 cases that you read for today. And we're going to use these 2 cases to examine how this Christian idea of the law of love first came to be part of American law, and then more recently, how the Christian tradition of law and other religious traditions of law have come to be situated rather uncomfortably in American legal institutions as American society has secularized over time. We'll start with Barger versus Barringer, North Carolina Supreme Court, 1909.
For more understanding of law, rights, and each other, see my new book, The Age of Selfies, Reasoning About Rights When the Stakes Are Personal. And visit my website, www.adamjmcleod.com.